problem of the abuse of women, especially women journalists online, is getting worse. At least that seems to be the consensus emanating from a number of studies and a trending issue in the news cycle as we celebrated International Women's Day earlier this week. A joint survey by UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists reveals that 73% of women journalists reported having faced online violence while doing their job. It's a frightening statistic, but it also tallies with another UN investigation which shows that in general, the pendulum is swinging against women's rights, worryingly, even among some women too. A study of 75 countries, 90% of those surveyed, it showed, are prejudiced against women in one way or another. Here with me today to discuss these escalating attacks is Zimbabwean journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate Reyhana Masters, who spends much of her time monitoring media rights and freedoms on the continent. I'm your host, Gwen Lister, for this 26th edition of the NMT's Free Speak podcast, in which we discuss all things media. Welcome, Reyhana, on the line from Harare.
Thank you, Gwen. It's really good to be here, and especially to be discussing such a critical issue and very important topic on the continent.
It's absolutely vital. And Reyhana, just to dive in, I noted that in the UN report on their Gender Social Norms Index, that Zimbabwe, of all countries, showed the highest amount of prejudice towards women. So I guess it's small wonder then that women and journalists online are abused to such a horrific degree. How prolific do you think this problem is in Africa generally?
So, Gwen, I think we should start from the fact that COVID-19, and everything that went with it, the regulation, the lockdown, really highlighted the violence against women.
Right.
Across globally, to be honest, but also across the continent. And, the country that stands out in my mind is South Africa. All of a sudden, calls to call centers doubled, messages to that, I think it's the a command center doubled. You saw women going in to seek medical treatment. So, that's what's happening offline in society is very reflective of what then takes place online.
Exactly.
And that's something to notice. And what was interesting is that many of the protests, over this time was also against, the violence that women were seeing. And it was women who were going out on the streets to protest. I mean, even in your own country.
Right.
When that young woman was killed, women went out on the streets. So I think there was, for me, I see signs of both. A kind of increase in violence and abuse against women, but also a time when women found voice and started becoming more vocal about the issues. Okay, and you're right, the situation in Zimbabwe is grim, particularly, but it's very reflective of the trends that we are seeing in society. There's been more attacks against women, especially women in politics. I see that growing worldwide. And while men, and there's always been this argument that, look, the online attacks are against men and women. That's true. I mean, you're seeing an increase of that. But what we need to understand is that while there is the online violence against men, the online violence against women takes on other undertones.
Right.
It's sexualized. It is racialized. It's very misogynistic, women are doxxed. And, with culture plays a strong part in it, and religion. It has a profound impact on the way women. Culture and religion have a very profound impact on the way women are discussed.
Absolutely.
Inside the media, by the media, through the media, There's always this moral obligation on women, which is not as stringent on men. in headlines, the responsibility suggests that women are responsible for the crimes that take place against them. And I don't think I'll ever, there was a very interesting topic that was raised in Uganda by a number of organizations, Women's Uganda Network, Policy.org, a whole lot of various organizations in Uganda, because there was a woman whose pictures, intimate pictures, was shared online. And she was held responsible, and she was being prosecuted for it. And so they changed the nature of the language and the narrative.
Right.
They basically said, look, we're not going to call it revenge porn, because then you're intimating that this is pornographic.
Right.
But why should a woman not be allowed to share her intimate pictures? The fact is that when it was shared by somebody who now had some kind of vendetta against her, it was shared without her consent. And we need to talk about that so that we deal with the crime in that way. Yeah? So I think those are interesting things, especially when you talk about, she was attacked because of what she wears, the way she talks, the way she conducts herself. But, these attacks are about power. And that's the thing we have to keep conveying as we continue with our conversation.
I think that's very important, Reyhana, and also really the point you made that we're talking about online violence specifically now against women, but that's a reflection of what is happening in, call it, real life. And of course, we know the consequences to women. I mean, even online, they can be physically harmed, they can be stalked, psychologically damaged, and at the end of the day, for women journalists, afraid of doing their jobs. I think it's worthwhile noting the example of Lindsay Dentlinger of ENCA in South Africa. I think we all acknowledge that Lindsay made a mistake, but the kind of mob justice that followed, including threats of rape against her, is just totally unacceptable. I was stunned to see when I looked at the comments that as many women as men were going after her. On the other hand, of course, there are many other women journalists doing their jobs online and suffering in silence. So maybe, do you have any comments on the case of Lindsay Dentlinger, and what can media employers do to better protect women journalists online or in real life?
Yeah, actually, you brought up a very interesting case because, it's a case that has a lot of nuances to it, especially, in this part of the world.
Yes.
And, yes, she made a mistake. And a lot of us are not defending her mistake at all. But what I noticed almost immediately in the aftermath of this mistake was the fact that their protection of her was very lukewarm,
Right.
the nation that was very lukewarm. And what I think they should have done is really face it head on. And, sometimes we do have our biases in many ways that we ourselves are not aware of. And
Absolutely.
it's something that's an open conversation to start having. We should have had that conversation, especially in the context of, Black Lives Matter. What do we do unconsciously? What do we do consciously? And in that conversation, we can bring up the issue of how men speak about women as well. So it could have been a conversation that could have had, could have been done more in depth. And I think ENCA failed to do that. They tried to gloss over it and find the appropriate language. And that was their biggest mistake.
Exactly.
Because then it increased the attacks because there was a feeling, especially in South Africa, that, look, you're not respecting this issue at all. And especially here in our country where we have such deep divisions, a post-apartheid kind of, behavior that's still being perpetuated. And seeing her body of work and seeing her as a journalist, you do realize that she has a professional attitude. She conducts herself pretty well in other situations. So, let's extract this and unpack and unpack it for the rest of us. So that was the first mistake I think they made. And yeah, women journalists are suffering in silence, absolutely. And, as you say, there's a tendency to physically harm them more. But this language that you see online against women is so aggressive, and it's not something that people will do in public. It's easy to do it online. You're not visible. You're not physically confronting that person face to face. But can you imagine them trying to say it on air, in front of the person?
Absolutely.
In a televised broadcast? It wouldn't happen, because then it would be more insidious. It would be far more, vile kind of behavior that will be called out instantly.
Yes.
I think that's what's critical here.
And the other thing is, Reyhana, just to add to that, I think we need to note that Lindsay herself has apologized, but in a sense, the damage has been done. And as far as I can establish from her Twitter account, she hasn't tweeted since the incident. So again, people have succeeded in silencing a voice which, as you say, given her body of work over many decades, is that she's essentially a good journalist and made this one mistake and is being silenced because of it. But of course, there are also much publicized international cases. If we look at someone like Maria Ressa of Rappler in the Philippines, who showed that apparently in a survey about all the tweets and the Facebook posts about her, her feeling is that Facebook is less safe than Twitter. Now, I'm not on Facebook, but on the other hand, I've seen some pretty vicious stuff on Twitter, and Lindsay's case is an example in point. What are your observations about abuse as it pertains to various social media platforms in Africa? Is one worse than another?
Should we be doing comparisons? Was my question.
Yeah.
I saw the attacks on Maria Ressa, and I tell you, they're attacking her at every level. It's about her race. It's about her gender. It's about her sexual identity. They're attacking her in every way possible,
right.
In all the isms that you can think of.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I really was quite upset about the comparison. And that's where the problem lies. Should we be talking about women are attacked more than men? They're less safe. Facebook is,
worse than Twitter.
Is worse than Twitter. Shouldn't we be talking about the fact that, listen, should we be attacked?
Right.
Should journalists be attacked?
Right.
Should people be attacked for their opinions? Okay. They should be castigated for something they do, such as, Lindsay made a mistake. Yes, let's call out the mistake. But should we be attacking her and wanting to rape her? How less is that a crime? How much less of crime is that? And when you keep doing the comparisons, you then don't focus on what the problem is. And the problem is increasing violence, especially online violence, because you can hide behind your anonymity. I can never say that word.
Anonymity, yes. And it's sidelining the truth,
Exactly, and sidelining the issue.
Right.
And what we're seeing is that in society, because of the culture of impunity, you're seeing more and more attacks against women. You're seeing the fact that it's coming from political leadership. When you talk about Zimbabwe, I think there's that very well-known incident on the stream on Al Jazeera when one of, our politicians is actually the Director of Information and Publicity in ZANU-PF, swore under his breath,
right.
thinking, he was not on camera. Is that acceptable behavior? Especially when you are in a very powerful arena, the arena of politics. Is that the kind of behavior you should be conveying? And those are the conversations we should be having. Where is this violence coming from? Why is it being allowed to be perpetuated? Why is there so much misogyny? And, should that not be diminishing? Why is it increasing?
Exactly. And really just to get to the root of the problem and, as you say, not sort of intellectualize about where it may be worse or better. But also Rana Ayub, who is also another much vilified woman journalist online, and a Washington Post columnist recently said, and I quote, "There's nothing more liberating than speaking the truth," unquote. And this may be so, and that's what we should be doing. But of course, that comes at a great cost to women personally. And I often think about, obviously, Rana and Maria and so on are in the international spotlight because of what's been happening to them. But I'm sure that this is a lot worse, and I think you've already alluded to that, in other countries where those women journalists just don't have that kind of world stage, if you like, for their cases to be much publicized. What do you think about that, Reyhana? Does it bear out your surveys?
Yes, looking through, looking at violations across the continent, the personalities, the celebrity
Right.
personalities tend to get much more attention. And as a result, you then don't look at the issue more holistically.
Exactly.
In particular, the attacks against Maria and Rana have been vicious. But the thing is, you also have to look at the attacks themselves. Rana Ayub is reporting in an area of conflict.
Exactly.
And her truth getting out is what is by attacking her, you're then attacking the issues that she's bringing out.
Exactly.
So that's part of this equation that we're looking at. In this part of the world, what you're seeing is, as it is, women are very reluctant to get onto this new platform, and for that very reason, not just about being bullied online, but they are always being held accountable for anything that they do. Yes. And in a way that is magnified, that is not magnified for men. So in politics, they have to think so carefully before they give out a soundbite, because that soundbite will haunt them for a long time. Men can say, male politicians can say the most ridiculous things.
And people laugh at them.
Doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to make sense, but, they will always be sought out for the soundbites. And they will never be ridiculed in the same way. It won't come to them 10 years later. They won't be haunted by it 10 years later. A woman will even fix it.
No, that's absolutely right, yes.
Yeah. So their reluctance to go online is then magnified by the fact that they are then attacked online. So if they're not in the spotlight, and the thing is, like you pointed out much earlier, that they're attacked as much by women as they are by men. So that patriarchy, we absorb it. In the same way that you saw Lindsay, sort of unconsciously, being biased, that's the same way that women are then perpetuating those biases without really thinking about the attacks that they are involved in and are part of.
Exactly.
And so we should be having different conversations, and we should be looking at this from different perspectives, and looking at issues of tolerance, versus, hate speech. The bigger conversation is free expression. Like, how far can you go with your free expression? How can you, how do you expand tolerance for other views? And right now, if you look at the politics of the continent, you can see that there isn't that tolerance in any kind of view that's different to yours. You're either with us or against us. It's a very much that kind of attitude.
Absolutely.
And so, so then it goes online and it's expanded to, so women as well. If you hold a different viewpoint, if you tend to push a certain argument and you're on solid ground, you're not tolerated because of all the other intolerances. That's more of what I see.
Absolutely. And Reyhana, I've always felt, I think all of us need to dig deep, everyone that is, because I think at the end of the day, all of us have prejudices of some kind, or bias, whatever you like to call it. I prefer the word prejudice because it's stronger. And I think we need to dig deep and say, what are those prejudices and how do I deal with them? They may be fairly simple things. I don't like tall people. I don't like fat people. I don't like people from Southeast Asia, whatever it may be. I think everybody has some element of that. And you're right that this is what really needs to be done. We need to dig deep and find a way to tolerance. Another finding of the UN report, coincidentally, was that a majority of sources of online violence, nearly 60% in fact, are anonymous. And this always bothers me because, of course, it makes it difficult to investigate and even identify the perpetrators, as should be the case. So that results in a lot of impunity for some of these vicious attacks. What, just maybe briefly, because I don't want to get sidetracked into that arena, but what do you think the role and responsibility of tech giants is in this regard? And how can civil society play a role?
I think we can sum this up very, very simply. If you are making billions out of your platform, then surely you should be able to invest some of it in taking protective measures against online violence. And you can do it in an impactful and effective way. That's the reason you've become this, tech giant.
Right.
So, yeah, so then let's use that technology to support what is a flaw in the use of your platforms. That's what I would say, very simply.
Exactly. And maybe also, it's something I always stress, but I don't think it's finding much resonance, is rather than after the fact investigating all these awful things, looking somehow at, before people go online, what can be done to make people aware of ethical codes, as you say, of the bounds of intolerance, and looking at your rights end where mine begin and vice versa, that type of effect. But leading into that, the silencing of women's voices online obviously has a chill effect on press freedom and free expression and ultimately democracy itself. So, Reyhana, from your perspective, what advice would you give to young women and young women journalists who are now going online? What coping mechanisms, because it seems almost inevitable that people are going to go after them in one way or another for whatever they've said or done. What kind of coping mechanisms could you suggest for them to be as, if you like, as immune as possible from all the attacks?
Well, first of all, let's start off with the question that you asked earlier, and which I don't think I responded to adequately. That when you have people like Maria Ressa, Rana Ayub, Fred Al-Hafaji being attacked,
Right.
your very well-known personalities, and they are intimidated, by these online and very vicious attacks. I think it's to try and to look at their stories, to understand those stories. Okay, that's very important,
Right.
and to get a sense of what they went through. There's numerous tools at the moment being offered on a variety of platforms. You need to look for them. I think that's definitely something I would advise all people to do, whether they're male journalists or female journalists. I think it's to understand and identify the type of attacks that are out there, okay? Because you're better able to deal with it when you know. Is it a political action? Is it someone trying to stop you from pursuing a story? Is it just an opportunistic threat? Is it misogynistic behavior and, which is violating you? Is it harassment? Is it some kind of sexual harassment? So identifying it will give you a better, tool to be able to deal with it.
Right.
I think there's need for cultural shift, and there have to be more efficient systems that address these kind of barriers that are out there, and we have to have those conversations as a collective, civil society, the media itself, men and women, and again, remember what we said earlier, no comparisons. Let's talk about what's happening. Let's have these real conversations. I want to be trying as practical as possible. I think you've also got to be you have, from what I see and read from other users and people who have been attacked, you have got to develop some kind of thick skin.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, I think, and Gwen, that just even from your journalism, when you first entered a very male-dominated field,
Right.
And that doesn't mean you lose a sense of who you are as a woman, or get lost in that system or become part of the system. It means being conscious of it and dealing with it with grace, but being firm about being able to say, hey, listen, I'm not tolerating that, and I'm not going to be intimidated by that.
Exactly.
I think that's the biggest issue. The whole aim of these attacks is to intimidate you. And I feel that often, even if you are sort of, upset by it, angered by it, almost cowed by it, you still go out and you never show that. You can deal with it in other ways. But out there, you do not allow that intimidation to take away from the work that you are doing or the story that you are working on. You actually, people like me, it makes me determined to be there,
Absolutely.
determined to take them on. Yeah. And I think you're like that too. But look, we don't all have that nature.
Exactly.
But
we're not all tough cookies, but yeah. So, but as you say, they do need to develop a thick skin. And I think also, Reyhana, the cases of Maria and Rana and these famous journalists in the world who are being so attacked, I think it's probably good that their cases are much publicized, because it does draw attention to the issue and the sort of magnitude of the problem, which is huge. The other thing is, just briefly on women journalists going online, I think perhaps it might be good that they should also, especially, could I say, tread carefully, especially in the initial stages as they start out in journalism, and stick to journalism online rather than, because I think social media has done that to all of us. We were journalists once upon a time who didn't express our opinions. We simply did our work and we did our stories, getting our multiple sources and so on. And now here we are on social media and we can say anything about anything as well. So sometimes the line between journalism and also just airing our own opinions, they should be, that's not to say they shouldn't do it, but they should be a little bit circumspect. And that doesn't just apply to women journalists, it applies to women online generally. I know you probably think the same. Every now and then one will see a woman in one's ambit posting perhaps a suggestive pose of herself in a bathing costume at a lake, and it may be fine to do, but immediately as a woman you start to think to yourself, oh my goodness, is she aware that by doing that, people, especially men, are going to come after her and she's going to get some unwanted attention? So, as I say, one's got a kind of nervousness when you watch these young people go out there not realizing what can exactly come after them. But Reyhana, finally, perhaps right at the end, because I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, we could speak for a week on this. But it seems to me that we live in an era where I would think there is a much more or much deeper consciousness of human rights than there was, say, 20 years ago. And yet, as we've discussed today, intolerance, prejudice, and abuse towards women and other minorities has escalated. What is your feeling? Has this intolerance always been there, or is it just social media that has amplified it and making us seem as though the problem is so much greater than it was a couple of years back? Your final thoughts.
Okay, it reminds me of this something I saw in a WhatsApp group that we were naughty when we were teenagers. We were naughty too. It's just that they weren't cell phones to record these moments. I think social media does amplify what's been there for a long time. However, I'm also going to say that it's the levels of impunity. The systemic violence that you see and abuse a lot of it is being perpetuated by the powerful. Okay?
Yeah.
And, things happen gradually. If behavior continues going unchecked, then people are going to push the boundaries further and further. So, for example, sexual harassment for a long time, even in our own newsroom, has gone unchecked.
Absolutely.
Let's look at UN bodies that have been unaccountable for their actions as peacekeepers. you haven't seen any kind of action taken against them.
Exactly.
The skewed politics around justice. For example, the head of IMF, Dominic Strauss-Kahn, he has not paid the penalty he should. So if you are seeing abuse at that level going unchecked, it is going to filter down. And when you see, for example, and I'll give you a very good example. Here in Zimbabwe, over the last few weeks, there was huge discussion about a minister in Zimbabwe who had been calling up women and, basically getting sexual favors in return for, in return for many things. But what was interesting was the discussions that were going online. There were a lot of attacks. He was being called out for his behavior, but so were the women. Some of them, we don't know what that relationship entails, but definitely there was power play, in those, in that, relationship. What was so interesting is that, yes, he's resigned. Minister has since resigned.
Yes.
What action was taken? What action was taken for his abuse of power? And by the way, I think this was a very deliberate ploy to get rid of him, but also what is happening at that level? Because there are many men in those positions of power, and I think in some cases also women, in those positions of power who are abusing that power. And that's the conversation that should have been taking place, but it didn't. There were personal attacks on the women, there were personal attacks on him. It got so personal that in all of that, what was wrong and the fact that it was sexual abuse and sexual harassment was lost in that conversation. So I think it's the level of impunity. You go, even though you commit this crime, okay, your behavior goes unchecked. There is no consequence for it.
Absolutely.
And online, you see that more and more because, it's anonymous. You're not paying. For example, in South Africa, when actor Somizi went out and attacked the two journalists who were asking him basic journalistic questions because he is in the public eye.
Absolutely.
Went out and had a rant on social media, and then his fans attacked the journalist and said, we'll come to you. And they even talked about harming the families. How are you able to do that and not be checked for that kind of abuse?
Of behavior. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where the issue is. But the problem is also it will be caught up in the whole issue of how much do you curtail online and how much of free expression do you allow. And, we've got to understand that and be able to counter those arguments effectively. Gwen, we've also got to educate ourselves, and I think it is about having conversations about these very important things, which we are not having.
Absolutely. And also, in a sense, the example you've just given, one would think those people actually do know better. So this is the issue which brings us back to human rights. We do know it's wrong. And things like misogyny, it's a very insidious thing, isn't it? And sometimes it just creeps into things and then obviously grows in stature and soon it becomes a huge problem. So people need to just give themselves a reality check and remind themselves. And I think it's a good adage, if you like, to say that, my rights end where yours begin. And if we try to remember that, and as you've emphasized, also sort of engage tolerance all the time towards women, towards anybody else who's different, that things could be substantially different and we could have better conversations online where women feel safe to say what they need to say. Reyhana, last word, and then we'll shut down.
I think we have to go back to the drawing board and really look at the impact also of culture. Culture has played a huge impact on this.
Very critical.
Very critical, And while a lot has evolved, the position and status of women hasn't. The way they are addressed, the way they are, the way they're addressed in communities, the way, are they respected? their roles are diminished, and I think that when that changes and what happens in society changes, you'll see that reflected elsewhere too.
I think that's a wonderful note on which to end this podcast. And Reyhana, thanks again for taking the time. Much appreciated. Thank
Pleasure,
you.
Gwen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Reyhana.